Tonight, we step into a world where elegance was laced with suffering, where a woman's grace could be measured by how well she hid the pain beneath her smile, or the blood beneath her corset. This isn't just a story about dangerous fashion. It's about the silent toll taken by beauty standards so cruel. They crushed ribs, burned scalps, and poisoned skin, all in the name of refinement. But why did millions embrace these rituals, knowing what they could lose? And beneath the powder and silk, was there ever a moment when someone finally said enough? Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to uncover the haunting, hidden history behind beauty that killed. It begins, not with screams, but with a hush. The hush of drawing rooms where women sat perfectly still, their lungs compressed, their waists cinched tight, their bodies molded into the shape of grace. From the outside, it looked like elegance. Inside, it was something else entirely, something closer to endurance. In Victorian England, beauty was not a gift. It was a task, a trial, a discipline that began in girlhood and followed a woman into the grave. There was no moment of choosing, no point where a girl might ask if she wished to participate. It was already chosen for her, by the culture, by the class, by the mirror, by the whispers of mothers who had once been girls themselves. The corset was the first vow she made to that unspoken covenant. Lace behind her back, ribs drawn together like pages of a book pressed shut, it taught her that restriction could look like refinement. That to suffer silently was a kind of moral achievement. The ideal Victorian woman was not simply beautiful. She was correct. Modest, pale, fragile in appearance but unyielding in poise. Her cheeks were to glow only faintly, her waist to measure no more than 2 hands' span, her voice to carry only kindness, never complaint. She must be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the quiet architect of the home's moral center. But nowhere in that list was she expected to be comfortable, or safe, or free. The pressure was literal. Corsets of whalebone and steel crushed not just the lungs and liver, but the spirit. Women wore them in sleep, during pregnancy, after childbirth. It was not uncommon for ribs to bend inward, leaving grooves on organs. Digestion suffered. Breathing became shallow. Fainting became fashionable, and the presence of smelling salts at social events was seen as entirely natural. A woman who swooned was delicate, and delicate was desirable. And yet, this was only the beginning. The face, too, had to be curated. Pale skin was not simply preferred, it was proof of status. A woman untouched by the sun had clearly not worked in the fields. But to maintain that porcelain appearance required arsenic pills, ammonia-soaked cloths, and lead-laced powders. Freckles were enemies. So were blemishes. But the cures were worse than the afflictions. Slowly, invisibly, poison accumulated beneath the skin. Lips trembled. Teeth fell. Minds frayed. And still the routine continued. There was no regulation. No warning labels. No one to say stop. Products were passed from hand to hand, recipe to recipe. Creams promised clarity. Tonics whispered purity. But behind the glass jars and ivory pots, death waited patiently. And she came not as a thief, but as a friend, a silent, familiar shadow who merely finished what the beauty rituals began. Mothers taught daughters. Sisters helped sisters. There was a grim intimacy to it all. A shared endurance. Women learned early not to flinch at the sting of bleach, not to cry out when the hot iron caught skin instead of hair. And perhaps, most cruelly of all, they learned to smile through it. To accept pain not as a sign of error, but as confirmation that they were doing it right. The salons offered little relief. There, amid the clatter of curlers and mirrors, the expectations sharpened. New methods emerged, permanent wave machines that burned hair to ash. Hatpins so long they were banned on trains. Voluminous hairstyles supported by rats, bundles of shed hair, pinned into place. Each trend came with its own hazards, its own invisible toll. And yet, women followed them eagerly, chasing a standard that always remained just out of reach. What they feared, more than injury, was invisibility. To be unfashionable was to be irrelevant. To fall from favor was to risk everything, marriage prospects, social invitations, reputation. In a society where a woman's value was measured by how she was seen, the cost of beauty seemed preferable to the alternative, being unseen altogether. Even childhood offered no reprieve. Young girls were dressed in corsets and taught posture with rulers pressed to their backs. Their spines learned submission before their voices did. Play was permitted, but only the gentle kind. No sun. No dirt. No loudness. Dolls were dressed in miniature versions of their mothers' gowns. Tea parties rehearsed future silences. Fathers, brothers, husbands rarely understood the full scope of what women endured. They saw only the result, the calm exterior, the graceful figure, the charming smile. The pain remained invisible. And when a woman faltered, when her nerves broke or her body gave out, the blame often fell on her character. She was weak, overly sensitive, hysterical. The system never examined itself. It only demanded more. But the cracks were forming. By the 1880s, voices rose in protest. The Rational Dress Society declared war on fashion that deformed the body. Feminists began to ask aloud what women had whispered for years. Why must beauty hurt? Why must elegance mean erasure? These were radical questions. Dangerous ones. And yet they spread. Still, change came slowly. Magazines continued to feature impossibly small waists. Department stores sold arsenic creams well into the 20th century. And even those who questioned the system often participated in it, unable to escape the expectations engraved so deeply into the culture. The mirror was not a neutral object. It was a battleground. Every glance was a reckoning. Did one measure up? Was the line of the jaw too strong? The waist too wide? The skin too dark? These questions were asked not once, but daily. Hourly. Each reflection offered a verdict, and the sentence was carried out in rouge and ribbon, lace and lie. And yet, somehow, women endured. They held each other up. Shared safer recipes. Whispered warnings. Laughed when they could. Loved in spite of it all. There was resistance in survival. In waking up each day and choosing, again, to participate, or not. In daring to ask if a new way might be possible. This was the world Victorian beauty created, a palace made of pain, lined with pearls and poison. And every woman within it was both prisoner and queen, both architect and captive. Her legacy is not the fashion plates left behind. It is the question that still lingers: what price do we pay to be beautiful? And who taught us to think it was worth it? Tonight, we begin to answer that question. Not with judgment, but with understanding. Not with blame, but with memory. Because to look back at the past is not to mock it, but to listen to the voices it buried beneath layers of silk and soot. And their stories deserve to be heard. Imagine the first feeling of morning, the looseness of your limbs, the easy rise of your breath, the quiet rhythm of your body unrestrained. Now imagine surrendering all of that, willingly, day after day, for the illusion of grace. In Victorian drawing rooms and candlelit boudoirs, women stood before polished mirrors as maids pulled at laces with steady force. A corset, stiffened with steel, cinched with precision, became not just a garment, but a ritual. The sound of it tightening was almost like music in the parlors of the elite, a private concert of creaking fabric and held breath. This was not simply about shape. It was about sacrifice. About training the body to obey, to yield, to compress, to sculpt itself into the impossible. In that age, the hourglass was more than a silhouette. It was a symbol of purity, restraint, and moral superiority. A straight spine. A narrow waist. A soul contained. Mothers passed corsets to daughters the way soldiers inherit armor, with both pride and quiet fear. Girls as young as 4 or 5 were given smaller versions to accustom their bodies early. Their bones, still soft with youth, bent gently under silk and pressure. They did not complain. They were told it was beautiful. The invention of the metal eyelet in the early 19th century only deepened the obsession. Tight lacing became more extreme. Fashion magazines praised 16-inch waists. Artists painted women whose torsos vanished beneath folds of fabric. Theater posters exaggerated curves until they bordered on parody. But this was no joke to the women inside the garments. Corsets were made with whalebone, or steel stays. The former could snap under strain, the latter dug in cold and unforgiving. Some corsets had as many as 30 stays, stitched between layers of heavy fabric. These weren't merely clothing, they were devices, engineered with intention. Many were worn from morning until night, with a lighter version slipped on for sleep. Over time, the body adapted. Ribs shifted inward. Organs moved. Medical drawings from the time reveal livers pressed sharply upward, lungs that could not fully expand. Digestion was slowed. Breathing was shallow. Women fainted, not from fragility, but from suffocation. And yet, fainting became romanticized, even fashionable. A lady who collapsed in the heat of a dance floor was seen not as unwell, but as refined. Doctors raised concerns. Some wrote pamphlets. Others lectured on the dangers. But society listened to the magazines, not the medics. And as one doctor remarked bitterly, "No medical man has yet invented a medicine to rival the flattery of a compliment." Pregnant women wore special corsets too, adjustable, designed to grow with the belly. One might imagine this was a mercy. It was not. The extra strain led to miscarriages, prolapse, and injury. But childbirth pain was considered holy. Motherhood was a duty. Discomfort was proof of devotion. There are preserved corsets from this era with waistbands no wider than the width of 2 open palms. Trophies of a time when pain was virtue, and the more tightly a woman could contain herself, the more society believed she was good. Outside, corseted women floated through garden parties and sat quietly during musical recitals. They seemed calm, composed, angelic. But inside, behind the bodices and boning, their bodies were crying out. Spines ached. Guts twisted. Skin bruised. The pressure was constant. The beauty was sharp. And perhaps strangest of all, many women felt proud. Not because they didn't suffer, but because they endured. Endurance became its own kind of beauty. To suffer quietly, to never complain, to be elegant through the ache, these were the hallmarks of a successful woman. But the seams were beginning to pull. Change was stirring. Soon, a rebellion would be born not from war, but from breath. A demand not for power, but for oxygen. And in quiet corners of society, women were beginning to ask, what if comfort could be beautiful too? Let us follow them there. Slowly. Carefully. Into Chapter 3, where seams begin to loosen, and minds begin to expand. It was never just a garment. It was a ritual. A sentence. A shape into which women poured themselves, until their bodies bent to it, and eventually broke beneath it. The corset, with its ribbons, whalebone, and steel, was more than a tool of fashion. It was a sculptor's mold for the living body. And in the Victorian home, it was as constant as the ticking of the mantel clock. Every morning began with a breath, and then a struggle for less of it. Silk chemise, drawers, petticoats, and then the corset. Tightened in stages, pulled from behind by a mother, a sister, a lady's maid. Fingers threading the laces, tightening inch by inch, until the waist was pinched to something delicate, unnatural, almost ornamental. A proper woman was not simply dressed. She was shaped. Sculpted into civility. The corset was never just for appearances. It was moral armor. To go without it was to invite suspicion. What kind of woman wouldn't discipline her form? Loose waist suggested loose conduct. A tightly cinched silhouette was believed to represent tightly cinched virtues. You weren't just admired, you were trusted. And trust, in this era, was worth more than comfort. They were worn everywhere. In drawing rooms and dining halls, on coaches across rain-soaked streets, even under parasols in colonial heat. Manufacturers made tropical corsets, ventilated, lighter weight, but still stiff enough to restrict breath and movement. Because even in India or Egypt, a lady must not let her dignity soften. And beneath the fabric was a truth few spoke of aloud. The aching ribs. The bruises along the side. The feeling of lungs never fully expanding. Women learned to speak in a floating tone, light and clipped, not from grace, but necessity. Deep breaths were luxuries corsets didn't allow. Laughter had to be measured. Sobs were silenced by compression. Mothers started their daughters young. Girls were laced into training corsets as early as 7 or 8. The bones were still soft then, pliable. That made them easier to mold. "You'll get used to it," they said, as girls learned to sit still for hours, spine perfectly straight, waist neatly bound. "It's for your future," they whispered, as the world's expectations settled onto narrow shoulders and narrowing torsos. Doctors began to worry. Not all at once, but gradually, as autopsies revealed livers misshapen, lungs compressed, stomachs displaced. Diagrams were drawn showing how the corset rearranged the body like furniture in a too small room. The ribs folded inward. The pelvis tilted. The intestines crowded toward the spine. It wasn't a theory, it was a transformation etched into flesh. And yet, women endured it. They had to. A slender waist was worth more than good posture or free movement. It was a ticket to marriage, to reputation, to social survival. Magazines published guides on how many inches could be safely lost. Fashion houses bragged about wasp waists, under 18 inches. "She looked like she'd snap in the wind," the admirers would whisper. And still, they whispered admiringly. Even pregnancy didn't always grant a reprieve. Special maternity corsets were made, complete with flexible panels and side laces. They offered support, said the catalogs. But what they truly offered was denial, a way to pretend the body could expand without growing unruly, a way to hide the natural curves of motherhood under the practiced shape of modesty. Some corsets were worn day and night, loosened only slightly for sleep. The skin underneath grew pale, marked with permanent grooves. Bones adapted. Organs surrendered. And through it all, women smiled, tight-lipped, carefully posed, because to confess pain was to appear fragile, and to appear fragile was to risk being thought unstable. Hysteria was a word never far from the lips of a physician. There were women who refused. Brave, stubborn, or merely tired of the ache. Some joined movements like the Rational Dress Society, calling for reform. They published essays, spoke at clubs, even marched. But reform was slow. Too slow. Because for every woman ready to breathe freely, a dozen more still tightened their laces in silence. Not out of love for the corset, but fear of what lay beyond it. Illustrations from the time show fashionable women with impossibly small waists and overflowing skirts. But they never show the bruises beneath. They never show the servant's hands pulling the laces tight, or the girl's quiet gasp as her ribs gave way. Art hides pain. That was part of the corset's genius, its ability to beautify suffering until the suffering no longer looked like sacrifice. But sometimes the truth broke through. Women fainted at balls, stumbled down steps, fell silent mid-sentence. Doctors called it corset sickness. Blood vessels burst. Fainting couches weren't luxury, they were necessity. Some women simply disappeared from public life, invalid, by the slow damage of decades wrapped in stiff brocade. And yet, the corset also gave some women a kind of power. It made them into silhouettes of legend, figures that walked like porcelain dolls through salons and society pages. Beauty, for a moment, could be weaponized. It could turn heads, win favor, change a destiny. But the price was never small. And when the lace finally loosened, years later, what remained was not always a body that remembered how to stand on its own. Imagine that moment, a woman in her twilight years, her corset finally hung on its peg, her waist no longer pinched, her breath coming deeper now. But the ache in her spine still lingers. Her ribs remember. Her muscles have forgotten how to stretch. And in her mirror, she sees not just her reflection, but the silhouette that once trapped her. The corset was not evil. It was not magic. It was merely a reflection, a mirror held up to a society that valued form over function, restraint over comfort, illusion over truth. And every ribbon tied was another thread in that complex tapestry of gender, power, and beauty. So as you lie back tonight, and the weight of the day leaves your chest, take a moment to breathe deeply. Fully. freely. Think of those who could not. And let their memory deepen your appreciation for each breath, unbound and wholly your own. The morning light in a Victorian bedroom did not bring relief. It brought a new ritual of risk. The fire in the hearth may have kept the room from freezing, but what sat on the dressing table beside it was colder still. Jars and bottles, powders and pastes, potions for beauty. And every one of them, in some way, held danger. To be a woman in the Victorian era was to chase a particular kind of perfection. Pale. Porcelain. Ageless. The perfect complexion was not a gift, it was a duty. And achieving it meant opening one's pores not to nature, but to poison. Day after day, layer after layer, women applied death to their faces in the name of elegance. Lead. Arsenic. Mercury. These were not abstract threats. They were ingredients. Found in powders, lotions, tonics, and creams. Some were sold in apothecaries, others passed from hand to hand, recipes whispered between mothers and daughters. A dab here. A touch there. It would smooth the skin, they said. Remove freckles. Erase blemishes. Make you glow. And it worked for a time. The skin did seem whiter. Smoother. More luminous in candlelight. But that illusion came at a terrible price. Lead seeped into the bloodstream. Arsenic disrupted the organs. Mercury ate away at the nerves. Symptoms came slowly at first. Fatigue. Trembling hands. Faintness. A rash that wouldn't heal. But still, women applied the creams. Society rewarded the illusion. A pale woman was delicate. Refined. A lady of leisure who did not work in the sun. Her skin became a marker of class, and that marker had to be maintained at any cost. Advertisements promised miraculous results. Erase every flaw, they shouted. But none mentioned the toll on the liver, the damage to the kidneys, the whispers of madness that followed prolonged mercury use. Young girls were not spared. Mothers wanted their daughters to have every advantage. So the rituals began early. A freckle tonic in spring. A whitening cream in autumn. Before long, the mirror stopped showing a face. It showed a mask, one that had to be reapplied each morning, patched each night, guarded fiercely against exposure. Rain was a threat. Tears even more so. And yet, to go barefaced was unthinkable. It suggested poverty. Illness. Immorality. Only those with nothing to lose would show their unadorned skin. A well-bred woman had a duty to be beautiful, and in this era, beauty was an act of concealment. The more you covered, the more you were praised. Behind closed doors, the damage worsened. Swollen gums. Loosened teeth. Hair that thinned until it came away in handfuls. Some women became reclusive, unwilling to let the world see what lay beneath the powders. Others doubled down, believing that the solution to their suffering was simply stronger product, more frequent application. Quack doctors sold remedies for the symptoms caused by the beauty products they also endorsed. It was a cycle, a trap, and the walls closed in slowly. A woman who had once been vibrant and healthy could, within a decade, become a ghost of herself. Eyes ringed with dark circles, voice faint, fingers trembling as they lifted the brush one more time. The few who dared to speak out were ignored. Or worse, laughed at. Hysteria, the physician said. Women are too sensitive. But the truth was plain to those who looked. Autopsies revealed organs ravaged by heavy metals. Hair samples laced with toxins. And still, the powders remained on shelves, the creams in cabinets. Because for every woman who suffered, there were 10 more waiting to take her place. To chase that ideal. To win the gaze of a suitor. To impress a mother-in-law. To feel, for one fleeting evening at a ball, like the most beautiful creature in the room. Even if her body was already beginning to rot beneath the satin gown. Some tried homemade alternatives. Rosewater. Honey. Oatmeal. But these natural remedies lacked the staying power of poison. They faded too fast. They didn't cover the scars. And so the arsenic returned. The lead. The mercury. All applied with care, with faith, with the quiet hope that this time, the damage wouldn't come. But it always came. Slowly. Silently. In the aching bones, the clouded vision, the child never carried to term. In the widow's veil worn too young. In the silence that followed a woman's retreat from society, her name spoken only in hushed tones. And yet, even now, we understand her. We know the hunger to be seen, the desperation to belong. The mirror still whispers lies, and we still listen. Only the ingredients have changed. So tonight, as you lie in your own quiet space, let your skin rest. Let your breath deepen. And remember those who never had that peace. The women who traded comfort for appearance, breath for beauty, and life itself for the shimmer of skin beneath the gaslight. They were not vain. They were brave. And their story is not one of shame, but of survival in a world that demanded they poison themselves to be loved. It begins with a hiss. Not the hiss of a snake or a whispered insult behind a fan, but the subtle, dangerous hiss of iron meeting hair. A metal tongue, glowing faintly red, lifted carefully from a fireplace. A curl wrapped delicately, almost reverently, around its length. The woman holding it keeps her arm steady. She's done this before. A dozen times, maybe more. And yet, every single time, there is that edge of fear. The possibility of a sudden sizzle. Of hair breaking off in blackened clumps. Of flame. This was the ritual many Edwardian women knew by heart. Before breakfast. Before letters. Before stepping out into the judging gaze of the world. Because in this age of refinement, a woman's hair was not simply hair. It was character. It was class. It was power and allure twisted into coils, pinned into waves, sprayed into stillness. And it came at a cost. To outsiders, the towering hairstyles of the early 1900s seemed like symbols of indulgence. Sculpted with patience, crowned with velvet bows or feathered hats, and often anchored with elaborate metal pins, these creations gave the illusion of ease. But beneath every fashionable coiffure lay a battlefield, scorched strands, irritated scalps, chemical burns, and heat-damaged roots. This chapter is about those costs. And the quiet, daily sacrifices behind the beauty. Let's begin with the most common tool of the time, the curling tongue. Before electricity became standard in homes, curling irons were heated manually, on gas burners, over open flames, or resting in the embers of coal fires. They had no thermostats. No insulation. Just bare metal that could reach searing temperatures in seconds. And women, often alone in their boudoirs or leaning before cold mirrors, would test the heat not with instruments, but with instinct. Some would flick water onto the iron and listen for the telltale spit. Others would touch it briefly to paper or a spare cloth. But too often, the iron was too hot. And hair, dry, fragile, or treated with oils, would burn. The smell of singed keratin became familiar. Not horrifying, just expected. Some women learned to twirl their curls tighter on burnt ends to mask the damage. Others, wealthier or with access to salons, might trim frequently, always chasing the illusion of thick health no matter the reality. But the pain was universal. Heated tools left blisters along the scalp line. They caused hair to break at the root, leading to patchy bald spots or thinning crowns, conditions that women rarely spoke of aloud. Beauty required silence. Even in suffering. By the early 1900s, the desire for permanence had entered the scene. Curls that could last for days, even weeks, became the new standard. And with that came a name now almost forgotten, Karl Nessler. A German-born hairdresser working in London, Nessler believed he could solve the frustration of daily styling. He invented a permanent wave machine, a contraption that looked more like a medieval torture device than a beauty tool. It involved metal rods, rubber pads, heavy clamps, and the application of caustic chemicals. Hair would be wrapped and treated with an alkaline paste, then subjected to 6 to 8 hours of heat. The results were often stunning, loose, elegant curls that held their shape. But the process was brutal. The chemicals could cause scalp burns. The heat led to dehydration of the hair shaft, weakening it to the point of snapping. Nessler's own wife reportedly lost her hair multiple times during the invention process. Still, Women queued up, desperate for a solution that would grant them the elegance seen in magazines without the daily battle with fire. One has to wonder, what drove this obsession? Why endure so much pain for something so temporary? Part of the answer lies in social status. A well-coiffed woman was a visible woman. She belonged to a class that could afford time, assistance, and luxury. The height of her pompadour, or the complexity of her waves could signal everything, from marital eligibility to economic power. In Edwardian society, appearance wasn't just vanity, it was social language. To neglect one's hair was to fall silent in a conversation everyone else was having. Then there was the emotional side, more fragile, more private. For many women, hair was the one domain they could fully control. In a world where careers were rare, independence discouraged, and education limited, styling one's hair was an act of agency. A way to define the self, even if that definition came wrapped in curls and scorched at the edges. But for those without means, the maids, seamstresses, and working women, the rituals looked different. Without access to trained stylists or imported products, they made do. Curling tongs might be borrowed. Homemade pomades made from pig fat and wax were used to hold shape. A friend might help with braids after a long shift. And while these efforts were often invisible to the upper classes, they were no less meaningful. For every heiress at a London ball, there were 1,000 women walking home under street lamps with hair pinned carefully beneath a bonnet, defying poverty with grace. By the 1910s, the tides of fashion began to shift again. Short hair, scandalous at first, started appearing on actresses and artists. The bob, the shingle, the finger wave. These were not just styles, they were declarations. They whispered of rebellion, of suffrage, of change. And yet even these new trends had their own risks. Chemical relaxers, harsh bleaches, early dyes that could cause rashes, swelling, or even temporary blindness. The battlefield simply moved, but it did not disappear. And so we must ask, was it worth it? Was the elegance of an Edwardian coif, balanced with pins, held with prayers, worth the hours of pain? The burns? The hair that never grew back? Perhaps the wrong question is why did they do it? Perhaps the better question is, why did they have to? Because in every age, women are told in subtle, merciless ways that their appearance is their currency. That to be desirable is to be seen. That to be beautiful is to be loved, or at least respected. And in eras where their voices were hushed, their rights limited, and their choices few, hair became something they could shape, even if it came with scars. So the next time you see a photograph of a woman in an Edwardian gown, hair swept high, ringlets falling like waterfalls from a jeweled comb, remember the hiss, the heat, the patience, the hidden burns. Behind every elegant silhouette, there may have been pain, endured not just for fashion, but for dignity. And that matters. Because beauty is never just about beauty. It is also about power, about control, and about survival. It always started with a mirror. A woman, perhaps barely 17, or already in the quiet bloom of middle age, would lean forward in the hush of early morning. A small hand mirror in one palm, the pale curve of her cheek caught in the flicker of lamplight. She would study her reflection not with vanity, but with obligation. Was her skin pale enough today? Were there freckles peeking through from yesterday's sun? Did she look refined, delicate, and, above all, untouched by the labors of the world? Because in the rigid beauty standards of Victorian society, a woman's face was not her own. It was a symbol. A canvas on which social class, morality, and femininity were painted and judged. And the tools of that transformation were anything but gentle. Victorian women didn't only suffer under corsets or in the grip of scorching irons. Beneath the surface, quite literally, they battled a slower, subtler enemy, poison. Not from a rival, not from a crime, but from the powders, creams, and tonics they applied to their own skin. Products sold in chemist shops, advertised in ladies' journals, whispered about among friends. Products filled with lead, mercury, arsenic, and ammonia. The mirror, for all its truth, was also a trap. To be beautiful was to be pale. not the healthy flush of activity, but the cool, ivory skin that proved one had never labored under the sun. Tan skin was a sign of poverty, of outdoor work, of exposure. Pale skin meant one belonged indoors, in parlors, not fields. A complexion like porcelain became the highest aspiration, even if it came at the cost of health, breath, and years of life. Let's begin with lead white, a powder so common in 19th century beauty routines that it was found in nearly every upper-class household. It was soft. It was bright. It clung to the skin with a satisfying opacity. When dusted across the cheeks, nose, and forehead, it erased blemishes, smoothed lines, and created the illusion of flawlessness. But it also seeped through pores. It entered the bloodstream. Over time, it attacked the nervous system, causing fatigue, irritability, muscle tremors, and in extreme cases, paralysis. Worse, it built up over time. Symptoms didn't appear in days or weeks. They unfolded over months, sometimes years, until the very person being praised for her radiance found herself collapsing into early death. The next culprit was arsenic, sold not in secret, but in elegantly packaged beauty wafers and skin tonics. Women were told it would purify the blood and clarify the skin, and in small doses, it did reduce redness and even out complexions. But arsenic also weakened the heart, damaged the kidneys, and led to anemia, memory loss, and delirium. Still, it remained popular. Because in the Victorian imagination, beauty was worth the gamble. Especially when the gamble was never fully explained. You see, these ingredients weren't regulated. There was no ingredients list. No required testing. If a cream made the skin whiter, that was success. If it caused slow death, well, that was unfortunate, but rarely publicized. And so, women kept applying, day after day, hoping to keep up with an ideal that was already toxic from the inside out. Then came mercury, often found in freckle removers and anti-aging creams. Mercury burned away pigmentation. It left skin raw, then smooth, then scarred. Over time, it led to tooth loss, tremors, and the slow decline of mental clarity. In Victorian asylums, some women labeled as hysterical or mad may have simply been victims of prolonged mercury poisoning, slowly robbed of cognition by the very beauty treatments they trusted. And yet these women were not foolish. They were not vain. They were trapped. Because Victorian womanhood was a performance, and the stage was relentless. To look tired was to look lazy. To have wrinkles was to seem old, regardless of age. To have freckles, redness, scars, or any trace of a life lived outdoors was to risk social suspicion. People whispered, was she respectable? Did she take care of herself? Was she, perhaps, a bit common? So each morning began with ritual. Open the jar. Dip the brush. Hide the signs of life beneath a layer of death. And beyond the creams and powders came the tonics, internal, beautifiers, that promised to detoxify the blood, stimulate clarity, and bring light to the eyes. Most were laced with alcohol, chloroform, or opiates. They were addictive. They dulled pain. They quieted rebellion. And for many women, they became a way to endure not just the physical pain of beauty, but the emotional weight of perfection. Because beauty, in the Victorian world, was not just about admiration. It was about control. It was a way of organizing society, of keeping women occupied, distracted, and dependent. The time, money, and energy spent on appearance left little room for rebellion, education, or independence. And the industries that sold them poisons were also the ones profiting from their silence. In one tragic case, a young woman in London, only 23, was found dead in her bedroom. The mirror was shattered. The jar of cream, half empty. Her doctor later revealed mercury poisoning as the cause. Her mother, devastated, said only this: she wanted to be looked at. What an epitaph. What a cost. Yet we must ask, how far have we really come? Today, our creams are safer. Our products are tested. But the pressure remains. The filters. The airbrushing. The creams that promise to erase decades. The injections, the surgeries, the endless promise of anti-aging. The language has changed, but the message is the same. You are not enough unless you change. And it begins still with a mirror. A mirror that has never learned to reflect the truth. Not the truth of beauty, but of resilience. Of women who, for centuries, endured, not because they were foolish, but because they were forced. Because the world demanded they be beautiful before they were allowed to be anything else. And that deserves remembering. Because history is not always heroic. Sometimes it is quiet, tragic, and painted in white powders that left no fingerprints. But tonight we see them. We remember them. And we keep their story alive. It wasn't just the face that bore the burden of Victorian beauty. Above every powdered cheek and crimson lip was another battlefield, quieter, smokier, and just as cruel. It lived on the scalp. And it was called fashion. A woman's hair, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, was more than a personal trait. It was her crown, her virtue, her presentation to the world. It framed her femininity. It whispered her status. And in the wrong shape, or in too plain a style, it could quietly close doors before she ever spoke a word. Long, thick hair wasn't merely admired. It was expected. The ideal was a cascade of soft, voluminous waves, effortless in appearance, but anything but effortless in creation. Because unlike the faces painted with poison, hair was tortured by fire. The process began at dawn. In gaslit homes and unventilated parlors, women, or more often, their maids, would heat metal curling irons in the open flame of a stove or candle. There were no thermostats. No timers. No protective gloves. You held the iron above the fire, counted a few seconds and hoped. Then pressed the scalding tool directly onto the strands, twisting and holding as steam hissed into the silence. The hair sizzled. The scalp burned. Sometimes it smoked. And still, the curling continued. There was no glamour in the act. Only a ritual of pain, performed quietly in the pursuit of perfection. And sometimes, it all went wrong. There are hundreds of documented cases, quiet tragedies that unfolded behind locked doors, where hair caught fire entirely. A sudden spark. A drop of oil. A slip of the wrist. And what had begun as a beauty routine ended in screams and singed cloth, and the smell of scorched skin. Some women were disfigured. Others died. The newspapers rarely reported it, unless the woman was rich. But in the margins of history, you can find their names. It was not a rare accident. It was a risk accepted. Because beauty in this world demanded suffering. Even worse was what came next, the next generation of innovation. In the Edwardian period, around the turn of the 20th century, a German hairdresser named Karl Nessler introduced something radical. A machine. A permanent wave device. A tangle of cords and heated rods suspended from a metal halo that hung above a woman's head like a twisted chandelier. The woman would sit for 6 hours beneath the buzzing apparatus while her hair, coated in caustic chemical paste, was steamed and seared into waves. Karl Nessler admitted to burning his own wife's hair off twice while testing the device. And yet the machine was a hit, because it promised permanence. It promised no more early mornings with firelit curling tongs. It promised elegance with less effort. But it did not promise safety. Scalps were scalded. Hair thinned, then vanished. And some women fainted from the sheer heat and chemical fumes. And yet, they came back. Because the advertisements whispered dreams. Lasting curls. High society style. A lady's refinement. And who could resist a dream, even one wrapped in wires and pain? But perhaps the greatest cruelty was what happened after the hair was ruined. When it fell out. When it refused to grow back. When baldness arrived, not from illness, but from effort. That's when desperation deepened. And a new market opened its doors. The world of false hair. Wigs, hairpieces, and extensions were sold across London and Paris, some made of real human hair, often from women in poverty who had sold their locks to survive. Others were synthetic, stiff, heavy, and hard to manage. Women pinned, wrapped, stuffed, and patted their hairdos to give the illusion of health and volume. even as their natural hair thinned beneath the weight. And underneath all of this effort, behind the creams and the curling, one truth remained. No one was really looking at the woman. Only her silhouette. Her polish. Her poise. The real person, the soul beneath the style, was invisible. So she curled her hair again. She lit the flame. She waited for the hiss. And she pretended the pain didn't matter. Because in Victorian beauty, pain was the price of being seen. The desire for a pale, porcelain complexion was not merely an aesthetic choice in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. It was a deeply embedded symbol of refinement, status, and femininity. A fair face distinguished the elite from the working class. It whispered of delicacy, purity, and the privilege of a life spent indoors, away from toil, away from sweat, away from the sun. But that soft, luminous glow did not come naturally for most, and the effort to attain it took women down paths laced with danger, deceit, and desperation. In bedrooms lit by dim candlelight, women rubbed their skin with white powders laced with lead, unknowingly inviting poison to seep slowly into their bloodstreams. Cosmetics in this era were largely unregulated. Recipes for homemade skin whiteners passed from woman to woman like family heirlooms, each one a toxic inheritance. Arsenic wafers were sold openly, promising to purify the complexion. They worked, in the sense that they slowly killed skin cells, leaving a ghostly pallor behind. The side effects, however, were devastating: chronic fatigue, nausea, liver failure, and in some cases, death. Mercury-based creams were similarly prized. They could remove freckles, erase blemishes, and lighten sunspots. But mercury is a neurotoxin. Prolonged use caused tremors, personality changes, and irreversible brain damage. It hollowed out the women who used it from within. Those who could afford imported powders often chose ones with a fine consistency, favored for their smoother application. But even the most expensive varieties contained dangerous ingredients. French powders, celebrated in fashion columns, often used crushed pearl and oxide of bismuth. These gave the skin a radiant sheen, but they also clogged pores and caused inflammation. Over time, women's faces became masks, cracked, swollen, and painful beneath the elegant disguise. Some developed lesions that never fully healed. Yet society demanded that the illusion be maintained at all costs. There was something ritualistic about the morning routine of the Edwardian woman. Each motion carried weight: the slow dusting of the cheeks, the precise placement of rouge, the careful lining of the eyes with kohl that may have contained lead. The mirror reflected not the face she woke with, but the one she was expected to wear, flawless, composed, and silent. Beauty in this world was not self-expression. It was duty. And the tools of that duty were treacherous. In upper-class drawing rooms and behind the velvet curtains of opera boxes, pale faces gleamed under the gaslights. The effect was ethereal, otherworldly. But these lights, a recent innovation, exposed imperfections cruelly. So women powdered more heavily than ever, layering toxic substance upon toxic substance. And in the crowded atmosphere of social gatherings, where perfume masked the scent of decay and illness, the consequences of these beauty rituals remained invisible to the casual eye. Only the doctors, and the dying, knew the truth. In poorer neighborhoods, women made do with what they had. Homemade concoctions were mixed in basins, combinations of vinegar, chalk, rice flour, and lye. These burned the skin but whitened it, at least temporarily. Street vendors sold creams from carts, many made with spoiled ingredients or harmful preservatives. But the desire to participate in the beauty ideal crossed class lines. Everyone, it seemed, was chasing the same illusion. Children, too, were not immune. Young girls learned early how to powder their noses, how to blush their cheeks just so. Mothers passed on recipes alongside lullabies. And slowly, silently, the poisons passed down, too. Some of these girls developed respiratory issues before reaching adolescence. Others struggled with miscarriages later in life, their organs compromised by years of toxic absorption. Generations bore the weight of invisible damage. The role of advertising in this phenomenon cannot be understated. Beauty columns in women's magazines were filled with glowing endorsements of products that, by today's standards, would be classified as hazardous waste. The language used was seductive. A radiant bloom, the eternal youth, a skin like ivory. It played on insecurity and aspiration in equal measure. And it worked. Women believed. They hoped. They obeyed. There were women who resisted, of course. Small voices in the medical field raised concerns. A few reformers began to speak of the dangers, but they were dismissed as hysterics or moralists. The majority of society remained enchanted by the spectacle. The face, after all, was the canvas upon which status, virtue, and femininity were painted. To bear it without adornment was unthinkable. Artists and photographers, too, contributed to the myth. Portraits softened the roughness of real skin, idealized features, erased flaws. These images circulated widely, reinforcing an impossible standard. Women compared themselves not to other women, but to retouched visions of perfection. And when they fell short, they reached for another cream, another powder, another promise. Behind closed doors, some women suffered quietly. Others went blind, victims of belladonna drops that widened their pupils while damaging their optic nerves. The drops gave a romantic, doe-eyed appearance, but at a devastating cost. Heart palpitations, hallucinations, blurred vision. The risk was known but often ignored. Yet, even as physical pain set in, as skin peeled, eyes burned, and headaches throbbed, many refused to stop. Because to stop was to fade, to lose visibility, to be deemed undesirable. In this world, beauty was survival. And survival required sacrifice. Some women wore veils when outside, not for modesty, but to protect their skin from the sun, lest it undo the hours of painful whitening. Gloves became standard, not just for elegance, but to shield the hands from darkening. Entire lives were lived under fabric, beneath layers, in shadow. To be pale was to be safe. To be darkened by nature was to be ashamed. Physicians treating upper-class women began noticing a pattern: unexplained tremors, chronic fatigue, organ failure in young, otherwise healthy patients. The link to cosmetics was suspected. Some even documented their findings. But powerful cosmetic companies and social pressure ensured that these warnings rarely reached the public. And so the rituals continued. The problem was not only the products, but the silence around them. Friends complimented each other's complexions without asking how it was achieved. Mothers urged their daughters to use what they themselves had suffered through. Society applauded the result and ignored the process. In rare moments of rebellion, a few brave women washed their faces clean and went out bare. But they were met with disapproval. Some were accused of being unkempt. Others were called scandalous, even immoral. The absence of paint was seen not as natural beauty, but as carelessness. Or worse, defiance. The advent of photography brought a cruel twist. What little illusion could be maintained in candlelight vanished under the camera's gaze. The pale powders reflected harshly, creating ghostly images. Yet instead of deterring use, this drove women to experiment with new formulas, new layers, new dangers. Writers and poets of the time occasionally alluded to the cost of beauty, veiled references to fading roses, to poisoned kisses, to hearts hidden behind masks. But these were metaphors, not warnings. The metaphor became a fashion, and the fashion became a death sentence. By the early 20th century, some awareness had begun to spread. Small health pamphlets cautioned against overuse. A few governments began discussing regulations. But it would be decades before real reform arrived. And for the women of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, the damage was already done. They had carried elegance like a burden, worn it like armor, and paid for it with their health, their breath, their very skin. Yet their legacy lives on, in every bottle of foundation, in every filtered selfie, in every unspoken rule about what a woman's face should be. This chapter is not just about what they wore. It's about what they endured, for the sake of being seen, being accepted, being loved. And in their silent suffering, we glimpse the darker side of history's most celebrated ideals. It begins, not with the clatter of teacups or the hush of lace skirts along polished floors, but with the stillness of a looking glass. Imagine, if you will, a woman seated at her vanity. The lamplight flickers softly behind her as she opens a jar the color of ivory. The cream inside gleams faintly, smooth, promising, and yet, unknown to her, deadly. With delicate fingers she applies it to her skin, smoothing it across her cheeks, her forehead, her chin. She does not flinch. This is beauty. This is what she's been taught to want. And what she's applying is arsenic. In the gilded world of Victorian and Edwardian society, pale skin was more than a fashion. It was proof. Proof that you were untouched by the sun, unblemished by labor, unspoiled by the hardships of the working class. It was proof of refinement, of separation. But true paleness did not come from lack of sunlight alone. It came in jars, in powders, in pills. It came, too often, at the cost of life. Arsenic beauty products were marketed with grace, their danger hidden behind elegant script and floral packaging. They promised a porcelain glow, the kind that artists painted and poets compared to moonlight. Women across Britain and Europe purchased them in trust. Some came in wafers to be swallowed, others in lotions to be spread. The results were often visible, but so were the consequences. The first sign was the flush of warmth under the skin, a mild irritation mistaken for radiance. But as weeks passed, that glow turned to rash, to peeling, to rawness. Yet still, they applied more. Because beauty, they believed, required discipline. And discomfort was just part of the path to elegance. That was what society had whispered to them since childhood. These arsenic-based cosmetics were not reserved only for the elite. Even working-class women saved to purchase small pots of pale powder, unaware they were spending hard-earned wages on something that might shorten their lives. Skin would thin. Hair might fall. Breathing could become more difficult. But none of these signs stopped the industry, nor the hunger for beauty. By the time the symptoms worsened, dizziness, fatigue, pain in the stomach, the cause was often no longer suspected to be the cream or tonic. Doctors misdiagnosed women with hysteria or digestive disorders. Some were told they had weak constitutions. Others were dismissed entirely. The truth lay quietly in the vanity drawer. And it was not only arsenic. Other ingredients proved just as insidious. Lead was a favorite among manufacturers, used in powders to create a ghost-like sheen. It sank into the pores, into the blood, into the bones. Prolonged use caused neurological symptoms, memory loss, tremors, weakness. But all the woman in the mirror saw was smoother skin. And that, they thought, was worth it. Mercury was another hidden specter. Found in skin-lightening creams and spot removers, it stripped away pigmentation with brutal efficiency. Over time, mercury exposure could cause paranoia, vision loss, and eventual madness. And still, society praised the result. A face unmarked, untanned, unstained. It was not sanity they demanded, but symmetry. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the eye drops. Belladonna, meaning beautiful woman, in Italian, was made from the toxic nightshade plant. A single drop in the eyes would dilate the pupils, making them appear larger, darker, more innocent, more seductive. But repeated use damaged eyesight permanently. And yet the fashion persisted. Advertisements did not warn. Instead, they spoke of romance and mystique. They played on insecurity, on the deep, aching need to be admired. To be seen as worthy in a world that offered women little power except through their appearance. Beauty was currency. And every dangerous drop or powder was another coin spent in the name of desirability. Mothers passed these routines to their daughters. Sisters shared their powders. Friends whispered about new concoctions behind fans and parasols. There was solidarity in the pursuit, and silence in the suffering. Few dared speak of what these products truly did. To question beauty was to question one's place in society. Yet there were voices that warned. Medical journals occasionally published notes of concern. A few doctors raised alarms. But most were ignored or ridiculed. Women's complaints were dismissed. Beauty was not a battlefield, not officially. And so, its casualties were never counted. The effect was not just physical. It was emotional. Women lived in quiet fear that a single blemish, a slight shadow beneath the eyes, a patch of redness on the cheeks, could brand them undesirable. Entire lives were shaped by the mirror's judgment, and society's echo of that judgment. The pressure was relentless, and the stakes, though hidden, were fatal. In aristocratic drawing rooms, among the rustle of silk and the clink of china, these poisons were discussed casually. Miracle creams, spot removers, evening tonics. No one called them what they were. And those who suffered were expected to endure it quietly, gracefully. There was dignity in silence, they were told. The tragedy deepened in poorer neighborhoods. Where products were cheaper, the poisons were often more concentrated. Regulations were nearly non-existent. Street vendors sold unlabeled lotions and powders that claimed to cure freckles or whiten the skin. The results were sometimes disfiguring. But for many women, there were no alternatives. One of the most chilling truths of the era is how fully society accepted this suffering. Beauty was not seen as optional. It was demanded. Without it, women lost opportunities, for marriage, for security, for respect. The cost of refusing was social exile. So they submitted. Not out of vanity, but out of necessity. Even those who suspected the danger often chose to continue. They made peace with the discomfort. They told themselves the symptoms were temporary. Or that they were different, that their skin could handle it. It was a gamble. And too often, it ended in quiet tragedy. Behind every elegant portrait from that era, every woman with porcelain skin and darkened eyes, lies a history of pain, of routine, of sacrifice, of trust betrayed by the very products sold to help them belong. Their beauty was praised. Their suffering ignored. And yet, in the background, resistance began to grow. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a handful of reformers began demanding transparency in product labeling. Women's health advocates called for change. Some magazines, quietly at first, began warning readers about the dangers of arsenic and lead. But the progress was slow. Too slow for many. Still, awareness spread. And eventually, legislation followed. In time, ingredients like arsenic and mercury were banned from cosmetics. Regulations improved. Warnings were printed. But the damage had already been done, to bodies, to lives, to generations raised to believe that beauty demanded pain. And so, we look back not with judgment, but with understanding. The women of that time were not vain. They were not foolish. They were navigating a system that gave them few choices and praised them only when they were perfect. Their beauty was a survival strategy. Their suffering, a hidden tax. Tonight, we remember them, not just for the grace they achieved, but for the pain they endured to reach it. Their reflections may have faded from the glass, but their stories linger, whispered softly from the cold jars left on dusty vanities, and from the ghostly sheen of powder long since swept away. So, the next time you look in a mirror, consider this: behind every face in history, there was a cost. And every shimmer of beauty came with a shadow. It doesn't begin in a palace or a parlor. It begins with the scent of singed hair. Faint. Lingering. The kind of smell that clings to curtains and reminds you something's gone too far. Imagine sitting before a fireplace, the iron rods glowing faintly red. You're still. A maid stands behind you, holding tongs she's just pulled from the coals. And you're about to sacrifice strands of your hair to the altar of fashion. For the Edwardian woman, beauty was not only demanded, it was expected to evolve. As the Victorian era faded and the new century stepped in, pale skin was no longer enough. Women were now expected to possess volume, height, and elegance atop their heads. Hairstyles became taller, more elaborate. Curls cascaded down like sculpture. And to create these looks, they turned to heat. The curling iron was no gentle tool. Heated over open flames, it was scalding, unregulated, and temperamental. Without any temperature gauge or safety barrier, women, and their servants, worked by instinct. Too cool, and the hair would fall limp. Too hot, and it would sizzle. There were no second chances. A single misstep meant burns, breakage, or baldness. And yet women lined up for it. For the prestige. For the admiration. for the approval of a society that made no allowance for imperfection. Pain, they were told, was part of the process. And so they flinched silently as hot iron skimmed their temples and brushed the tips of their ears. Redness was hidden beneath powder. Blisters became just another thing to endure. But curls were only the beginning. As the fashion for elaborate hairstyles grew, so too did the use of enhancements, false hair, wire frames, padding. Some women used rats, rolls of their own shed hair, gathered from combs and brushes, and formed into stuffing to build volume. These structures allowed for towering styles, but they also trapped heat. The scalp could not breathe. The skin beneath suffered. To maintain these towering masterpieces, women often washed their hair only once every few weeks. Instead, they used powders, made of rice flour, starch, or even lead, to keep the hair looking fresh. These powders, combined with sweat and soot, formed a sticky paste against the scalp. Infections were common. Lice became a quiet companion, but no one spoke of it openly. Beauty, after all, was meant to be effortless. And then came the machine. The promise of permanence. In 1906, Carl Nessler introduced the permanent wave machine, a marvel of modern beauty. It allowed women to wear curls that lasted for days or even weeks. But the process was anything but elegant. Hair was divided into sections, wrapped tightly around metal rods, and coated in a chemical paste. The rods were then heated with electricity or gas flames. The smell was overwhelming. The heat unbearable. Women would sit under the machine for 6 hours or more. Heads wrapped in wires. Faces stiff with anticipation. Sometimes the machine failed. Hair melted. Scalp burns became infections. But success was equally punishing, brittle curls that crackled when touched. Yet these waves were admired, coveted, pinned in magazines and celebrated in society salons. And so, they endured. Burns were explained away as clumsiness. Scalp damage dismissed as sensitivity. No one questioned the process. Because once you had undergone it, once you had sacrificed your comfort, you belonged to a different class. A different beauty. You had earned your place in the room. It was not just the upper class who suffered. Working class women, too, longed for elegance. Some attempted to replicate the styles at home, heating spoons over candles, or using stovetop tools. The risks multiplied. Kitchens caught fire. Hair was lost in seconds. Mothers passed these methods to daughters. The cycle continued. In the quieter corners of the city, you might find women who lost patches of hair, hiding under hats. Some suffered permanent baldness. Others bore scars hidden beneath carefully pinned curls. Their pain was invisible, because it had to be. Society did not offer grace to those who couldn't keep up. And the hat itself, it deserves a tale of its own. Wide-brimmed, feathered, and heavy with decoration, the Edwardian hat was not just a fashion statement. It was an obligation. And it needed to be anchored. Steel hatpins, sometimes up to 14 inches long, were driven through hair and hat to hold everything in place. One wrong move could pierce the scalp. In crowds, hatpins became dangerous. Banned from courtrooms. Feared on trams. Yet worn daily. But it wasn't just the skin and scalp that suffered. It was the nerves. The constant pressure. The knowledge that a slip, a burn, a spot of frizz could undo hours of preparation, and with it, your dignity. Women walked the streets with their necks held stiff, their shoulders tight. Perfection was not just desired, it was required. And for what? To be seen. To be admired. To be accepted into the ranks of women who had done the work. Fashion was more than style. It was status. Endurance. Proof that you belonged, even if your head throbbed, even if your scalp ached, even if your hair had begun to thin. Whispers of change came slowly. A few doctors began speaking against heated tools. Some women's magazines began suggesting natural styles. But progress was glacial. The machine still hummed. The irons still glowed. And the women still waited, hours on end, beneath the weight of beauty. Yet even amid the pain, there was resilience. Women shared tips to lessen the burn. They braided their hair at night to avoid tangles. They crafted intricate pins and combs to distract from damage. They supported one another, even if the world did not. And so, the curling continued. The irons still smoked. The machines still hissed. But behind every carefully sculpted curl was a story. Of heat. Of patience. Of quiet strength. Of women who turned their pain into poise, because that was what the world demanded of them. They did not do it for vanity. They did it for place. For belonging. For the same reason women through history have endured discomfort in silence. Because beauty was the price of being seen. And tonight we remember that price, not with judgment, but with understanding. Their hair may have shimmered. But behind the shine was fire. Real fire. Quiet pain. And a will to endure, hidden beneath every curl. It was never just about looking lovely in candlelight. Victorian beauty, so fragile, so admired, often masked a quiet violence. Not the kind that bruises the skin with fists, but the kind that settles into the bloodstream. Softly. Patiently. A whispering death that lived in powders and creams, in lotions passed between friends and daughters. This was not beauty you applied. It was beauty you survived. In the mirror, a woman might have admired her reflection, pale, porcelain, angelic. But the tools she used to become that image were not kind. Her face was an unspoken battlefield. Behind the glow of her cheeks and the stillness of her lips was a science of sickness. And it began with the simplest desire, to be seen as refined. Pale skin was the highest mark of elegance. A clean, untouched canvas. It told the world you did not labor under the sun. That your life was one of leisure and lace, not dirt and drudgery. But achieving that paleness required more than staying indoors. It meant application, daily, deliberate, and dangerous. Victorian face powders were not gentle. They were not kind. Many were laced with lead, mercury, or arsenic. These were not hidden ingredients. They were advertised openly. Their toxicity was known, but their beauty was valued more. Arsenic wafers promised to smooth the skin. Creams that stung the cheeks were believed to purify. Even poison had a place, if it made you beautiful. Lead-based powders clung to the pores. They dried the skin, cracked it, and then seeped into the blood. Slowly. Painfully. Mercury, used in tonics and spot treatments, stripped away blemishes and sanity. Its long-term use was known to cause trembling hands, memory loss, and hallucinations. But women returned to these bottles again and again. Because the result was beautiful. Briefly. Some face creams were so caustic they caused burns on the first application. But women persevered. They told themselves the redness meant it was working. The pain meant progress. They called it refinement. Society called it grace. And so, they continued, until the mirror began to reflect not beauty, but decay. Flesh grew thin. The skin took on a gray hue. Lips cracked, and teeth began to loosen. Arsenic did not merely purify, it consumed. Yet stopping was unthinkable. The face was a woman's introduction. Her mask. Her offering to the world. Without it, she feared becoming invisible. Advertisements made promises with no shame. Clear your skin in days, one read. Fade freckles and liver spots, said another. No mention of the organ damage. No warning of the fatigue, the numbness, the quiet death waiting beneath flawless cheeks. The beauty industry was booming, but it was built on poison. It wasn't just the skin that suffered. The eyes, too, were not spared. To achieve a soft, wide-eyed look, some women used belladonna drops, made from the deadly nightshade plant. A few drops in the eyes would dilate the pupils, giving an ethereal, innocent gaze. But belladonna did more than whiten eyes. It blurred vision. It caused headaches. It triggered heart irregularities. Repeated use led to blindness. And yet it was called lovely. The lips, too, bore their price. Rouge and lip stains were often made with carmine, ground insects, mixed with mercury or coal tar dyes. These dyes were absorbed through the delicate tissue of the mouth. Over time, they could cause kidney damage, breathing issues, and anemia. But the color was bold. It made a statement. It made her lips bloom red in the foggy light of gas lamps. And so, she wore it again. Even perfume, sweet and floral, carried threats. Many Victorian fragrances were made with unregulated alcohols, sometimes tainted with methanol or formaldehyde. The scent lingered. So did the headaches, the nausea, the fog of fatigue. But fragrance was femininity. Women doused their gloves, their letters, their hair. They carried their poison in silk bottles, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to know. By the late 19th century, some doctors began to speak out. Quiet warnings appeared in medical journals. Beware the arsenic complexion, one article read. Another warned of facial paralysis among beauty product users. But the warnings were not loud enough. Society's expectations still drowned them out. And for many women, it was not vanity. It was survival. A woman's appearance was her reputation, her ticket into a good marriage, her value in the eyes of strangers. If she aged, she was cast aside. If she freckled, she was called careless. If her cheeks sagged or her skin darkened, her status fell. So she painted, and powdered, and pretended. Because to be seen was to be safe. Behind each powdered face was a story of fear. Fear of being judged, of being dismissed, of being forgotten. And that fear made the poisons worth it. Even as the skin flaked. Even as the eyes dimmed. Even as the heartbeat faltered. It's easy to look back now and wonder how they did it. How they tolerated such pain. But the truth is, they didn't always know. And when they did know, they often had no other choice. The world demanded beauty, and gave them only poison to make it. And still, they stood. Still, they smiled. Still, they powdered their faces by candlelight, steady hands, silent hearts, and went out into the world wearing the mask that might keep them safe. Not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to endure what the world required. And tonight we remember them. Not just as victims of dangerous trends, but as survivors of a world that valued appearance more than health. Women who bore the weight of beauty with grace, even when the cost was their lives. It begins not with a scream, but a sizzle. A faint hiss, barely audible over the crackling fire. The sound of heat pressing into hair, hair carefully curled, twisted, and teased into beauty. You can almost smell it. The sharp, burnt tang of scorched strands and singed scalp. In Edwardian drawing rooms and parlors, this was the background noise of elegance. And it came at a price. At the dawn of the 20th century, beauty's battlefield shifted from the waist to the head. The corset was loosening, ever so slightly. Women were beginning to move, to breathe, to walk without fainting. But the freedom came with a new expectation. If the waist was no longer the sole symbol of femininity, something else had to take its place. And so, all eyes turned upward, to the hair. To be fashionable in Edwardian England was to carry a tower upon one's head. Hair had to be full, voluminous, dramatic. Not simply arranged, but sculpted. Hair became architecture. Styles like the Gibson girl were romanticized, tall, soft, and impossibly thick. Yet very few women were born with the necessary volume to achieve such shapes. So they faked it. They added false hair, often collected from the dead or purchased from salons that cut from the poor. They stuffed their buns with hair rats, little pillows made from their own shed strands, saved from brushes and combs. And they turned to heat. Curling became an essential daily ritual. But there were no safety switches, no digital controls, no ceramic shields. Instead, metal rods were heated over open flames, fireplaces, gas stoves, candles. The iron was placed directly into the fire until it glowed faintly red, then plunged into hair. Women learned to move fast. Too slow, and the iron would melt the hair clean off. Too fast, and the curl would not hold. There was no room for hesitation. And so, they burned themselves often. Fingers blistered. Scalp skin peeled. And still, they curled. Mothers passed down tricks for avoiding burns. Some would test the iron against a paper slip or a piece of cloth. But even then, accidents were frequent. And what was lost could not grow back easily. Hair did not forgive. Those who could afford it went to salons, where women sat for hours beneath the looming wires of permanent wave machines, monstrous contraptions invented by Karl Nessler. The hair was coiled around rods, soaked in alkaline solution, and then blasted with steam for 6 hours. Nessler once admitted he had burned off his wife's hair twice during early trials. But still, women came, lured by the dream of effortless curls. Inside these salons, the air was thick with chemical fumes, ammonia, borax, formaldehyde. There were no windows open, no warnings printed. Just the hum of conversation and the hiss of boiling water, all underpinned by quiet suffering. But it was not only heat that haunted Edwardian hair. To maintain the towering styles, women relied on pomades and oils, some made from bear fat, others from coal tar. These concoctions coated the scalp, clogged the pores, and trapped dirt. But they gave hair a shine, and that was what mattered. Hairpins, too, were deadly in their own right. Massive hats perched atop these elaborate styles needed anchoring. Women used steel pins up to 14 inches long, stabbing them through hair and hat alike. In crowded streets, they were a hazard. On trams, they were banned. In some courts, they were confiscated for fear they could be used as weapons. Still, women pinned, and burned, and steamed, and bled. Why? Why endure so much for the sake of hair? Because a woman's hair was not just hair. It was virtue. It was identity. It was the silent language of class, status, desirability. To let it fall flat was to fall short. And so, even when it hurt, even when it scarred, they pressed on. Even children were not spared. Girls as young as 12 had their hair hot ironed before church or social outings. Many sat crying as the iron hovered over their scalps. But the result was lovely. And loveliness was everything. Some women developed traction alopecia, a condition caused by repeated pulling and tension. Others suffered burns so deep they never healed cleanly. There were reports of permanent baldness, of weeping sores, of infections that spread. But these stories were not printed in beauty manuals. They were whispered between sisters. The irony is sharp, that in trying to become more beautiful, so many women lost the very thing they sought to perfect. Some wore wigs to cover the scars. Others simply stopped going out. In the twilight of the Edwardian era, a quiet rebellion began to stir. Women began to cut their hair shorter, a scandalous act at first. But freedom grew with each snip. The bob became more than a style. It became a symbol of independence. A way to step out of pain and into power. But for decades, the damage had already been done. The old ways lingered. And many never saw a life where beauty did not come with injury. Tonight, as you lie back and drift between thought and dream, remember them. The women with scorched fingers, blistered scalps, and quiet courage. They shaped each curl as if shaping their own fate. They carried their injuries behind smiles and silken veils. And though their stories were never headlines, their suffering deserves a voice. Not because they were foolish, but because the world demanded too much. Let them rest now. Let the irons cool. Let the flames fade. And as you close your eyes, may the silence they never had surround you. It is late evening in an Edwardian bedroom. A single lamp flickers beside a wooden dressing table, its dull light casting long shadows across the floor. A woman sits silently, staring into the slightly warped reflection of her mirror. Her eyes are heavy, her back slouched. In one hand she clutches a comb. In the other, a small clump of her own hair. It is not the first time this has happened. Nor will it be the last. She gently sets the strands aside, hiding them in a drawer filled with similar souvenirs. Then she dips her fingers into a jar of oil, hoping it will soothe the stinging patch on her scalp. She doesn't cry. She doesn't sigh. This is simply routine now. To be beautiful, one must endure. Hair was more than an accessory in Victorian and Edwardian society. It was a social emblem, a symbol of health, youth, and most importantly, moral character. To wear one's hair clean, styled, and properly pinned was not just fashion, it was virtue. Disheveled hair hinted at poor upbringing, laziness, or even madness. For married women, it suggested marital neglect. For unmarried girls, it hinted at shame. But achieving those perfectly structured coiffures demanded more than patience and pins. It required heat, chemicals, and a tolerance for pain so high that even modern salons would wince. To begin with, cleanliness was its own trial. Hot running water was a rare luxury in most households, especially for working-class women. Hair washing was an ordeal performed once a week or less, using harsh soaps and boiled water. Afterward came the drying, a process not aided by hair dryers, but by sitting near open fires, risking burns, smoke inhalation, and the occasional singed lock. But the washing was only the beginning. The true labor began with styling. Women in the 19th and early 20th centuries often desired styles that required substantial volume, towering buns, cascading curls, and intricate braids that defied gravity and time. For those born without naturally thick hair, help came in the form of false additions. Enter the market of hairpieces, some made from animal fibers, others from human hair bought, stolen, or cut from the heads of the desperate. Poor women in France, Italy, and Eastern Europe often sold their hair to feed their families, unaware that their sacrifice would be woven into the glamour of London's elite. This imported hair was cleaned, dyed, and treated with lye before being incorporated into wigs, falls, and pads. But the most brutal weapon in the arsenal of beauty was heat. Curling irons of the era were long metal rods, heated over gas stoves or open flames. Women, or their servants, had to estimate the correct temperature by instinct alone. Too cool, and the iron wouldn't shape the hair. Too hot, and it would burn straight through it. Stories of women losing entire locks to one moment of overheating were not rare, they were expected. The burnt smell, the crispy edges, the gasping reaction when curls sizzled instead of curled, all these were part of the cost. Edwardian women called them scorch marks, but said it with the same grim acceptance as one might speak of scars earned in battle. In 1906, German hairdresser Karl Nessler offered a solution, the permanent wave machine. It was a marvel of technology, and a torture device in disguise. Hair was coated with alkaline chemicals, then wound tightly around heated metal rods. The contraption resembled a chandelier more than a beauty tool, with cords, clamps, and wires dangling like vines. The entire process took 6 hours. 6 hours of sitting completely still, scalp stinging, neck cramping, under the constant risk of chemical burns or electrocution. Nessler himself admitted to burning off his wife's hair twice while testing the machine. But women still came. They came with hope. With longing. With the belief that 6 hours of suffering was a fair exchange for the promise of elegance. The dangers didn't stop at the salon. The chemicals used in these early perms were often caustic, mixtures of borax, quicklime, ammonia, and caustic soda. The fumes were suffocating. If left too long, they didn't just ruin hair, they melted it. Reports began circulating of women losing their eyebrows, eyelashes, and even vision due to poorly ventilated treatments. Yet salons kept advertising. They called it science, progress, the future of womanhood. And women believed them, because they had to. Because to be admired, to be seen, was worth the risk. Not all women could afford such innovations. For the lower classes, beauty rituals were performed at home. Hot stones wrapped in cloth were used as makeshift curlers. Homemade concoctions of vinegar, coal dust, and goose fat served as treatments. The process was no less dangerous, perhaps more so, because it was guided by hearsay and hope rather than trained professionals. Still, the expectations did not change. A factory girl was expected to appear just as polished as a banker's wife, even if it meant waking up 2 hours earlier to boil water for her curlers. Even if it meant burning her fingers raw before a 12-hour shift. But the worst insult of all came later in life. When the body began to rebel, and hair began to fall. For many women, baldness became a quiet epidemic. It was whispered about in salons, denied in polite company, and hidden beneath ever larger hats and veils. Doctors offered solutions, many of them cruel. arsenic-based tonics, scalp stimulators that resembled cattle prods, even electrotherapy helmets, domes wired to deliver mild shocks in hopes of waking the follicles. None of it worked. All of it hurt. And still, the shame of thinning hair fell not on the methods that caused it, but on the woman herself. She was seen as a failure of femininity, a warning of what happens when beauty fades. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that for all the destruction hair rituals caused, they were also a source of deep pride and identity. Hair was one of the few things a woman could shape and control. It was how she presented herself to the world. How she marked transitions, youth to womanhood, courtship to marriage, mourning to recovery. Locks were clipped and saved in lockets, gifted to lovers, woven into wreaths. Hair was love. Hair was memory. And for many, hair was the last thing they clung to, even as it fell away. In the quiet moments of history, we see these women, not as victims of vanity, but as survivors of a system that demanded perfection at any cost. They bore the burns, the blisters, the bald spots, not for shallow reasons, but because they were told it was what made them worthy. Their suffering was invisible, their devotion unspoken. But now, as we look back with gentler eyes, we can begin to see the truth behind the curls, the pain behind the powder, and the strength behind the silence. It began not with cruelty, but with admiration. In the gaslit parlors and drawing rooms of Victorian England, women sat beneath portraits of swans and skylarks, surrounded by polished mahogany, patterned wallpaper, and cabinets of curiosities. Outside, nature was kept at arm's length, wild, unruly, and cold. But inside, the home became a private stage, curated and decorated to reflect beauty, order, and grace. It wasn't long before this reverence for natural elegance turned into something more tactile and more tragic. On a Sunday afternoon in 1888, in a well-to-do London street, a woman stepped out wearing a hat adorned with the full wings of a hummingbird. No one gasped. No one stared. This was fashion. This was refinement. But for every such hat, there were the silent bodies of birds, thousands upon thousands, lying uncounted in the wake of elegance. The Victorian woman was expected to be both ornamental and moral, a contradiction that stretched her in impossible directions. Her clothes had to be graceful but modest, fashionable but not vain. Yet hats, strangely enough, offered her a rare outlet for expression. They were large, daring, elaborate, one of the few socially acceptable canvases on which she could make a statement. And what better way to express refinement than with nature's own palette? Feathers were already common in millinery by the mid-19th century, but the trend escalated rapidly. By the 1870s and 1880s, feathers were no longer enough. Entire wings, heads, and even full taxidermied birds began to appear atop hats. Exotic birds were in especially high demand: egrets, birds of paradise, hummingbirds, and even owls, all chosen not for their rarity, but for the shimmer of their plumage, the length of their tail feathers, or the way they seemed to capture light even on England's cloudiest days. Few paused to ask where these birds came from. Fewer still asked how many were dying. The global feather trade had become one of the most profitable industries of the age, behind only gold, tea, and opium. Hunters in the American Everglades waded waist-deep into swamps, rifles in hand, targeting egrets during mating season when their plumage was at its finest. The cruelest part? These birds were shot while nesting, meaning their chicks starved in the nest as their mothers were turned into decoration. In Borneo, India, and the Amazon, birds of paradise were caught, killed, and plucked, not for food, but for fashion. London and Paris were the epicenters of this trade. Bales of feathers arrived daily at docks, sorted by child laborers in dusty warehouses, packed into boxes with names like Morning Black, Bridal Ivory, or Imperial Sapphire. From there, they went to milliners, craftsmen who transformed death into delicate beauty, using wires, glue, and pins to shape wings and beaks into floral patterns or frozen flight. In polite society, these hats were admired, even envied. They were the finishing touch of an outfit, the crown of a woman's public identity. Young girls dreamed of the day they'd wear one. But they were also symbols of status, a silent signal that one's husband could afford luxury. As such, the demand only grew. By the 1890s, it was estimated that over 200 million birds a year were being killed globally for fashion. And all of it, for something that served no function beyond beauty. The feather trade was so enormous that it drove some species to near extinction. In Florida alone, entire islands of birds vanished in less than a decade. Hunters reported returning to nesting grounds only to find silence. Not a single call, not a single flight, just the sound of wind over empty branches. Not everyone was blind to this devastation. A quiet resistance began to stir, not among lawmakers or scientists, but among women. In 1889, outraged by the senseless deaths, a small group of women in Croydon, England, formed what would become the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. At first, they were mocked. Critics called them sentimental, hysterical, too emotional to understand, commerce. But their message was simple, that a bird's life was not worth a hat. They began publishing pamphlets, naming and shaming the worst offenders in high society. They pleaded with women not to wear feathered hats, not out of fashion rebellion, but out of moral responsibility. Slowly, their voices grew louder. Membership spread to thousands. They held lectures, wrote letters to editors, and created art showing the beauty of living birds in flight, a beauty that no hat could match. Still, change came slowly. Milliners resisted. Department stores profited. Hunters lobbied to keep their trade legal. And many women, raised in a society where beauty was a duty, felt torn. To remove the feathers from their hats meant removing the one adornment that made them feel seen. Even Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII, was famously fond of elaborate feathered hats, setting a tone that made resistance even harder. The conflict wasn't just ethical. It was emotional. How do you ask a woman who has been denied education, denied independence, and denied voice to also deny herself the one thing that gave her social presence? It wasn't simple vanity. It was survival. Eventually, the tide did begin to turn. By the early 20th century, import bans on certain feathers were introduced. Public support for bird conservation swelled. Even school children were taught to recognize protected species. But the wounds had already been deep. The snowy egret, once common in North America, was down to mere dozens in some areas. The great crested grebe, once hunted relentlessly in the UK for both feathers and skin, was nearly wiped out. And countless species disappeared before science had even named them. What remained behind were not just bones and empty nests, but questions. What does it mean to love beauty, so much that we destroy the thing we admire? What do we sacrifice when we turn a living creature into a status symbol? And what, if anything, do we owe to the animals whose bodies made our elegance possible? For the Edwardian woman, those questions rarely came with answers. She could not undo the feathers on her hat, nor unhear the applause she received for wearing it. But perhaps, somewhere deep inside she felt it. A twinge of guilt. A moment of quiet. A recognition that the silence of the birds was not natural. That something, somewhere, had been lost. And perhaps, as she laid her hat on the table at night, brushing a fallen feather off the brim, she knew, just for a second, that elegance always leaves a shadow. Even in the most polished drawing room. Even in the most refined mind. Even in the quiet beating of wings, long gone. By the time the 20th century arrived, the world had begun to shimmer with a new kind of light. It was no longer candle or gas, but electricity, mysterious, glowing, silent. It buzzed behind walls and whispered through wires, promising progress, safety, and comfort. In polished Edwardian households, this was the new elegance, not corsets or feathers, but polished copper kettles, heated irons, and miracle machines that washed, dried, and cleaned. The women of this age, after enduring decades of physical beauty torment, were told they had been liberated by modernity. But the illusion was fragile, and danger had only changed its shape. Imagine a young woman in 1910, standing proudly in her kitchen, surrounded by the newest electric devices. A curling iron glows on the table. A kettle simmers without a fire. and the iron she holds hums faintly, its cord fraying at the base. These tools were sold as saviors. No more scorched dresses from open flames, no more soot-stained fingers. But in reality, many of these early appliances were death traps. Wires were often cheaply made, with little insulation. Metal casings offered no protection against shocks. And few homes had reliable fuses or grounding. Safety was not yet a language manufacturers had learned to speak. And still, these machines were irresistible. They sparkled with possibility. They filled magazines with smiling women using them in high heels and silk dresses. Advertisements whispered that the ideal woman had not only a graceful figure and clear skin, but an efficient, modern home. Her worth now lived in how effortlessly she could maintain cleanliness, cook meals, and host guests, all while appearing serene. Beauty had shifted from body to environment. But the pressure remained. A home, like a corset, had to be tight, clean, controlled. Even electricity itself was marketed as feminine. Bright, clean, silent, invisible. Posters portrayed it like a domestic spirit, a goddess of efficiency. But behind the elegance lay very real fear. There were countless cases of women killed by irons, shocked by faulty washing machines, burned by loose wires. One tragic tale told of a woman who died while using an iron she had tied together with twine after the handle cracked. The cords sparked into the fray and she never stood up again. In those days, accidents were blamed on the user, not the product. She shouldn't have fixed it herself, they said. She should have known better. The deeper truth was harder to admit. That in their rush to modernize, to meet the growing demand of fashionable homes and stylish women, companies had cut corners. Beauty had simply moved from the mirror to the plug socket, but it was no less dangerous. And for many women, the home, once a supposed refuge from corsets and public scrutiny, became a new battlefield. Now she must be lovely, organized, gentle, efficient, and grateful, or risk being seen as lazy, backwards, or failed. Even the bathroom, newly plumbed and gleaming, became another site of performance. The woman had to rise early, bathe without complaint, press every dress, polish every surface, all with machines that hissed and buzzed and occasionally shocked. There was no instruction manual, no guide. Just trial and error. And error, in these years, could mean tragedy. It was around this time, the 1950s, that the people had had enough. Whispered complaints became written letters. Deaths became headlines. The Women's Institutes of Britain, often thought of as humble tea and biscuit gatherings, began quietly collecting stories. Mothers who lost daughters. Housewives who lived in fear of turning on the iron. Families who wondered if modernization had gone too far. And so, out of this silent storm, came something new, the Consumers Association. In 1957, they launched which? Magazine, a quiet revolution in black and white. It didn't sell gadgets. It tested them. Without loyalty, without glamour. Just facts. Cords were pulled. Irons were dropped. Kettles were boiled to the point of failure. And for the first time, consumers had someone on their side. Behind the clinical language of safety rating and electrical hazard lay something deeper, the beginning of a reckoning. That for over a century, women had been asked to suffer for beauty, for order, for expectation, and now, finally, someone was asking why. But for many, it was already too late. The corsets had been worn. The arsenic creams applied. The feathers had flown. The irons had sparked. The silent statistics of those who died from beauty's demands were never fully counted. There were no grave markers that read, "Victim of fashion." No public mourning for the birds, the burns, the poisoned girls. Only the occasional story in a dusty paper. Only the occasional burn mark on the kitchen wall. And yet, in this quiet tragedy, there is a strange kind of strength. The story of Victorian and Edwardian beauty is not just one of harm, it's one of endurance. These women were not weak. They were determined. They bore pain for dignity. They shaped themselves for approval. They followed rules they never wrote. And when the time came, they began to push back. Not with riots or rebellion, but with small, stubborn acts of refusal. A loosened corset. A featherless hat. A safer plug. A raised voice. Their legacy is not in the products they used, it's in the questions they left behind. What does it mean to suffer for beauty? Who defines the ideal? And what are we still willing to risk for admiration? Because even now, in our world of filters and fillers, of endless products and silent expectations, the echo remains. The corset has changed shape. The feathered hat has become a screen. But the pressure, the quiet, choking pressure, is still here. So as the screen fades to black, and the story ends, listen for what's left behind. Not the words, not the images, but the soft, steady breath of history. Of women who endured. Of lives once lived in quiet pain and determined grace. And as you fall asleep now, know this: beauty was never meant to be deadly. But it has always been demanding. And those demands, whispered through time, still reach us, even here, in the silence of your darkened room. And so, we close the quiet, haunting story. A story not of queens or battles, but of women. Ordinary, extraordinary women, who walked through a world that demanded their pain in exchange for praise, who bore it with grace, silence, and unimaginable strength. They were burned, broken, and reshaped, not just by corsets and cosmetics, but by the invisible weight of expectation. And yet, they endured. They adapted. They survived long enough for the questions to reach us. What do we inherit from them? What ideals still linger in the shadows of our mirrors, in the choices we make without even thinking? As the candlelight fades, and the house grows still, those questions remain, floating like dust in the air. Soft. Unsettling. Eternal. You've made it to the end, and I'm grateful you stayed. Now, if your eyes are heavy, let them close. Let the stories drift into silence. Let the fire sounds carry you softly away. Sleep well. You're safe now. And history is quiet again.